The BRICS countries are advocating for changes that better reflect the economic realities of the 21st century. They argue that current frameworks, such as those of the IMF and WTO, disproportionately benefit wealthy nations while failing to address the priorities of the global south. These demands include adjusting the IMF's quota system to provide emerging economies with more influence, as well as restoring the full effectiveness of the WTO's dispute resolution mechanism. The global south is committed to reforming the Western-dominated financial system, and is even considering creating alternative institutions to better meet its needs. In this video, we examine the reasons behind the widespread dissatisfaction with the IMF, and discuss the negative consequences of IMF loans in several countries of the global south, where they have harmed both people and economies. Let's begin by exploring the impacts of IMF lending and enforced policies in countries like Egypt, Brazil, and Morocco. Egypt. The 1977 bread riots. In January 1977, Egypt faced severe social unrest, known as the bread riots, after the government decided to reduce crucial subsidies on basic foodstuffs including bread, sugar, rice, and cooking oil. This decision was made to secure financial assistance from international institutions, like the IMF. The resulting price hikes led to immediate protests in major cities, including Cairo, Alexandria, and Suez. The protests, which began on January 18th, were initially led by industrial workers in Helwan, but soon spread to students and other citizens. The situation escalated when demonstrators attacked symbols of wealth and authority, such as police stations, government buildings, and luxury hotels. In response, President Anwar Sadat deployed the military to restore order, resulting in clashes that left around 80 dead, 550 injured, and more than 1,200 arrested. The government eventually reversed its decision to restore subsidies, aiming to stabilize the situation. Brazil. The IMF's impact in the late 1990s. In the late 1990s, Brazil was grappling with a severe economic crisis and turned to the IMF for help. In November 1998, the IMF approved a $41.5 billion support package for Brazil, but it was contingent upon the country implementing harsh austerity measures. These included deep cuts in public spending, tax increases, and sweeping reforms in the public sector, all aimed at reducing fiscal deficits. These measures led to significant reductions in government spending on essential services like healthcare, education, and social security, which disproportionately affected low-income populations. The public's reaction was swift and vehement, with widespread protests and strikes against the IMF-imposed austerity. Many argued that the focus on fiscal consolidation had worsened poverty and inequality, while stalling economic growth and social development. While some analysts believe the reforms were necessary for Brazil's long-term economic stability, helping control inflation and restoring investor confidence, others contend that the social costs were too high. In 2005, Brazil repaid its IMF loans early under President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, signaling improved financial independence. But the debate over the effectiveness of IMF austerity measures continues, particularly regarding the balance between economic reforms and social welfare. Morocco. The 1981 Casablanca bread riots. In May 1981, Morocco faced an economic crisis marked by a large budget deficit and rising external debt. To address these issues, the government, under King Hassan II, agreed to an IMF-backed austerity plan that included slashing subsidies on essential food items, such as flour, sugar, oil, milk, and butter, and the resulting price hikes: flour by 40%, sugar by 50%, oil by 28%, milk by 14%, and butter by 76%, triggered widespread unrest, culminating in the Casablanca bread riots on May 29, 1981. Thousands of people from impoverished neighborhoods took to the streets, targeting symbols of wealth such as banks, luxury cars, and pharmacies. The government's response was forceful, deploying police and military units to suppress the protests. Official reports state that 66 people were killed, but opposition sources suggest the death toll was much higher, with many victims being young people from the slums. The violent crackdown had long-lasting political consequences and highlighted the dangers of imposing austerity in a society reliant on subsidies for basic goods. The socio-economic realities of the Moroccan population during this period serve as a poignant example of the complex relationship between economic policy and social stability in Morocco's history. In the mid-1980s, Nigeria faced a severe economic downturn marked by falling oil prices, rising external debt, and depleting foreign reserves. In response, General Ibrahim Babangida's government implemented a Structural Adjustment Program, SAP, in July 1986, in collaboration with the International Monetary Fund. The program aimed to restructure Nigeria's economy by reducing its dependence on oil exports, promoting non-oil sectors, and achieving fiscal stability. However, the implementation of these policies led to immediate hardships for many Nigerians. The devaluation of the naira triggered inflation, raising the prices of imported goods and essential commodities. The removal of subsidies further increased living costs, disproportionately affecting low-income households. Widespread dissatisfaction culminated in the anti-ASAP riots between May and June 1989. The protests began on May 24, 1989, with a peaceful demonstration by students at the University of Benin, who marched with a mock coffin and green leaves, chanting slogans such as, "SAP must go," "We are dying of hunger in the name of ASAP," and "ASAP is a vampire." These demonstrations quickly escalated into nationwide unrest, involving students, workers, and other citizens. Major cities including Lagos, Ibadan, and Benin City saw mass protests, strikes, and clashes with security forces. The government responded with military force, resulting in numerous casualties and arrests. The SAP's strict measures led to a contraction of the economy, rising unemployment, and a decline in public services. These austerity measures strained the social fabric, exacerbating poverty and inequality. The unrest and the government's harsh response further destabilized the political environment, eroding public trust in leadership. The SAP era left a lasting impact on Nigeria's socio-economic landscape, with some arguing that the reforms were necessary for long-term economic stability, though the immediate social costs were profound. It remains a cautionary tale about the challenges of implementing externally prescribed economic reforms without sufficient social safety nets. In Venezuela, February 1989 saw the country plunged into a severe economic crisis, driven by declining oil revenues and increasing external debt. In response, President Carlos Andrés Pérez introduced austerity measures recommended by the International Monetary Fund. These measures, known as El Gran Viraje, or the Great Turn, were aimed at stabilizing the economy through structural adjustments. However, the sudden implementation of these measures led to widespread public discontent. On February 27, 1989, protests erupted in Guarenas, near Caracas, as commuters reacted to increased bus fares. The unrest quickly spread to Caracas and other cities, escalating into mass protests, riots, and looting in what became known as El Caracazo. President Pérez declared a state of emergency and suspended constitutional rights, deploying military forces to suppress the uprising, resulting in significant violence. While official reports stated 277 fatalities, independent estimates suggest that between 2,000 and 5,000 people were killed, many at the hands of security forces. The Caracazo had profound political consequences. The violent suppression of the protests eroded public trust in traditional political parties and institutions. The event is widely regarded as a catalyst for the rise of Hugo Chavez, who, as a lieutenant colonel, led a failed coup attempt in 1992 and later capitalized on public dissatisfaction to win the presidency in 1998. The Caracazo remains a pivotal event in Venezuela's history, symbolizing deep societal divisions and the volatile consequences of abrupt economic reforms. In the late 1990s, Indonesia was severely impacted by the Asian financial crisis, which led to a sharp depreciation of the Indonesian rupiah, soaring inflation, and widespread economic hardship. In response, President Suharto's government sought assistance from the International Monetary Fund in October 1997, securing a bailout package totaling approximately $43 billion. The austerity measures imposed in the late 1990s triggered widespread public discontent, particularly in May 1998, when protests erupted across Indonesia. These protests quickly escalated into riots, particularly in Jakarta, where the unrest focused on symbols of wealth and authority, resulting in extensive looting and property destruction. The Chinese-Indonesian community was disproportionately targeted with violent attacks. In response, the government deployed military forces to suppress the unrest, leading to numerous casualties, with some reports estimating over 1,000 deaths. The economic crisis and the ensuing social unrest severely undermined confidence in President Suharto's regime, and after mounting pressure, he resigned on May 21, 1998, after 31 years in power. Similarly, Pakistan has faced multiple rounds of austerity under agreements with the International Monetary Fund, IMF, since 1988, each requiring subsidy cuts and fiscal reforms. These measures aim to address fiscal imbalances and promote economic stability, but often led to public hardship, protests, and political unrest. Pakistan's early IMF programs included structural adjustments like reducing subsidies on essential goods and devaluing the national currency. This resulted in price hikes for basic commodities, adversely affecting low-income populations and sparking public demonstrations. Under President Pervez Musharraf, Pakistan secured nearly $2 billion in IMF support, but the austerity measures associated with this, such as cuts in public spending and further subsidy reductions, only worsened economic conditions. Protests ensued, contributing to political instability. A stark example of the growing discontent came in October 2024 when the Pakistani government raised taxes by 40% under an IMF bailout agreement, igniting widespread protests. Critics argue that such measures only deepened economic struggles, increasing inflation, unemployment, and straining public services, while proponents contend that they are necessary for long-term economic stability. In Kenya, the government implemented IMF-backed structural adjustment programs, SAPs, in the 1990s to tackle fiscal deficits and stagnation. These programs mandated privatization of state-owned enterprises and significant reductions in public spending. By 1995, Kenya had privatized over 100 firms, including tea factories and major entities like Kenya Airways and Kenya Commercial Bank. However, these changes did not deliver the anticipated economic revitalization. Instead, Kenya suffered from its worst economic performance since independence, with GDP stagnating and agricultural production contracting by 3.9% annually. The reduction in public spending, particularly in health and education, led to the introduction of user fees for services that had previously been subsidized, making essential services less accessible to the poor. This worsened health outcomes and educational attainment, particularly for low-income households, and sparked widespread protests. The SAPs were criticized for their rapid implementation and lack of tailored solutions for Kenya's unique challenges. The focus on privatization and market liberalization also failed to address underlying issues like unemployment, underemployment, market failures, and corruption. The IMF has faced significant criticism from countries in the global south, including those in the BRICS nations, regarding its lending practices and policy prescriptions. Key concerns include the implementation of structural adjustment programs in the 1980s and 1990s, which mandated austerity measures, privatization, and trade liberalization. Critics argue that these policies exacerbated poverty and inequality by prioritizing debt repayment over social welfare and development. Reductions in public spending often resulted in diminished access to essential services like healthcare and education, which adversely impacted vulnerable populations. Another major concern is the erosion of sovereignty. IMF-imposed reforms are seen as undermining national sovereignty, dictating economic policies that limit a country's autonomy and prioritize the interests of wealthier creditor nations. The IMF's decision-making structure is also criticized for being biased toward developed countries, with loan conditions favoring their interests and neglecting the needs of developing nations. This has led to perceptions of the IMF as an instrument of neo-colonial influence, undermining its legitimacy in the global south. The IMF's approach to debt restructuring has also been criticized for providing insufficient relief to debtor nations. Without a fair multilateral legal framework, many countries struggle to secure equitable terms, leading to cycles of borrowing and repayment that hinder sustainable development. Additionally, fiscal consolidation under IMF programs typically involves cuts to public spending on vital services like health and education. This exacerbates social inequalities and hampers long-term development, as reduced investment in these sectors can lead to poorer health outcomes and lower educational attainment among disadvantaged populations. These criticisms highlight the complex relationship between the IMF and Global South nations, stressing the need for reforms that promote equitable development, respect for national sovereignty, and more effective support for struggling economies. Thank you for watching this video. We truly appreciate your time and support. If you found this content valuable or inspiring, please like and subscribe to stay connected with our community. Your support means a lot to us. You can also check out another video from our channel, now displayed on the screen.